By 9 in the morning, Mara Bell knew something was wrong. The irrigation ditch behind her alfalfa field should have been carrying 6 inches of water by then. Instead, sunlight flashed off a ribbon of mud no wider than her hand. She climbed down from the tractor and stood at the edge of the ditch, staring upstream. Nothing, not a trickle, not even the familiar sound of water moving over stones behind her. The August heat pressed against the ranch like a heavy iron lid. The pasture had already begun losing its green. Dust lifted beneath the cattle's hooves as they crowded around the trough, nudging one another toward the last few inches of water. Her 16-year-old daughter, Ellie, came running from the barn. "Mom." Mara didn't turn. The trough's almost empty. "I know." "Did the pump break?" "No." Ellie followed her mother's eyes toward the dry ditch. For 73 years, water had reached this property through the same network of ditches that crossed the valley. Mara's grandfather had used it. Her father had used it. Mara had never once seen it completely dry during irrigation season until Silas Vane started buying water rights. He owned nearly 4,000 acres, now more land than anyone else in the valley. Over the previous 18 months, he had quietly purchased rights from retiring farmers, indebted families, and 2 ranchers who had simply given up. Mara had refused every offer 3 times. The 4th arrived that afternoon. A black pickup rolled slowly down the gravel road and stopped beside the farmhouse. Silas stepped out, wearing clean boots that looked almost insulting against the dust. He didn't bother pretending he was there to be friendly. "You got my letter?" Mara folded her arms. "I got it. The offer's still good. My answer's still no." Silas glanced toward the cattle, then toward the yellowing field. "You might feel different in 2 weeks." Ellie stood behind her mother. Silent. Mara's jaw tightened. "You shut off our water." Silas gave the smallest shrug. "I bought what was available to buy. That ditch has supplied this farm since before you were born. And history isn't ownership." He reached into his truck, pulled out an envelope and placed it on the hood. $180,000 for the property. Cash. No foreclosure. No auction. "You walk away clean." Mara didn't touch it. Silas smiled. "Think about what dry land is worth." Then he drove away. That evening, Ellie carried a bowl of water toward the old cattle dog sleeping beside the abandoned barn. She stopped halfway. The dog was lying in the shade. He was stretched across a patch of bare earth inside the ruined barn where the afternoon sun had been beating down for hours. Ellie frowned. She stepped inside. The air smelled of old hay, dust, and rotting timber. She knelt beside him and pressed her palm against the ground. Then she pulled it back. The earth was cold, not cool from shade, cold. Ellie moved her hand 6 inches to the left. Hot dust, 6 inches back, cold earth. She stared at the warped floorboards beneath the dog. And for the first time that day, the Bell Ranch had given them something Silas Vane hadn't bought. A question. The next morning, Mara found Ellie inside the abandoned barn before sunrise. She was kneeling beside the same patch of cold earth with a kitchen thermometer pushed into the dirt. Mara leaned against the doorway. "What are you doing?" Ellie looked up, checking if I imagined it, and Ellie pulled the thermometer free. 58 degrees. Mara glanced toward the open pasture. Even this early, the air was already warm. Probably an old drainage pipe. Maybe. Ellie didn't sound convinced. The barn had been abandoned for nearly 20 years. Its roof sagged in the center. One wall leaned slightly east, pushed out of line by decades of snow and wind. Mara's father had stopped keeping cattle there after building the newer pole barn farther downhill. Silas had always called it an eyesore. The first time he offered to buy the Bell property, he stood in almost the same doorway and told Mara he would tear the place down within a week. That had been 3 years earlier. Back then his offer seemed ridiculous. The Bell Ranch was only 126 acres, wedged between Silas Vane's expanding holdings on 3 sides. Much of the pasture was rocky. The house needed work. The fencing was older than Mara. There was nothing about the property that should have interested a man who already owned thousands of acres. Yet Silas kept coming back. First he offered $120,000, then $145,000, then $160,000. Each time Mara refused. Her father had died in that house. Her mother's apple trees still grew behind the kitchen. Ellie had learned to ride a horse in the south pasture. Selling the ranch would have solved almost every financial problem Mara had. It also would have erased the only place that still felt like theirs. But now the problem was larger than sentiment. Without irrigation, the ranch might not survive the summer. The bank payment was due in 6 weeks. Hay prices had nearly doubled, and the cattle could not drink memories. Mara walked toward the back wall of the barn. Her hand brushed against a beam where her father had carved measurements when she was a child. Mara age 8, Mara age 11. Another mark lower down read, Ellie age 6. Mara stared at it longer than she intended. Then something came back to her, a sentence her father used to repeat whenever drought hit the valley. "If everything dries up, watch the barn before you watch the creek." She had always assumed he meant bring the animals inside. Protect the feed. Save what you could, but standing over that inexplicably cold patch of ground. The words sounded different. Ellie. Her daughter looked up. Get the shovel. They pulled away the first rotten floorboard. Beneath it was packed soil. The second board revealed the same thing. But under the third, Ellie's shovel struck something hard. Not concrete. Not wood stone. She scraped away another layer of dirt. A straight edge appeared. Then another beside it. The stones had been placed deliberately. Ellie looked at her mother. Mom Mara crouched beside her. Whatever was beneath the old barn had not been put there by accident. By noon, Mara had already told Ellie twice to stop digging. By 12:30 she was holding the flashlight. They had removed 6 warped floorboards from the rear corner of the barn, exposing a rectangle of packed earth nearly 4 feet wide. The cold patch was larger than Ellie first thought and stranger. The soil along the outside edge was dry enough to crumble between her fingers, but toward the center, it darkened. Not wet, just damp enough to hold together. Ellie pressed her palm against it, still cold. Mara crouched beside her. How cold? Cold enough that it should be like this. That answer irritated Mara, because it sounded exactly like something her father would have said. Ellie took the shovel and scraped carefully around the stone they had found that morning. More appeared. 1 stone became 3. 3 became a line. Then the line turned at a right angle. Mara stopped her. That S a wall. Ellie brushed away the loose dirt with both hands. The stones were flat and fitted tightly together, not like field rock dumped into a foundation trench. Someone had chosen them, shaped the space, built something. The deeper Ellie dug, the cooler the air became. At first Mara thought she imagined it. Then she felt it too. A faint draft rose through a narrow gap between 2 stones. Ellie froze. You felt that? Mara nodded. She lowered her face closer. There was another sensation too. A smell, earth, mineral, something clean beneath decades of dust and mouse nests. Ellie crawled backward and looked toward the doorway. Outside, the August sun had turned the pasture white with heat. Inside, she could feel cool air rising from underground. What if it is a cellar? Mara shook her head. Too small. Root cellar? Maybe. Ellie looked around the barn again. That was when she noticed the grass along the collapsed northern wall. A narrow strip of green ran through the weeds. It was barely visible. 3 feet wide, maybe 20 feet long. Everything around it had gone yellow. That strip had not. She stepped outside and followed it. At the end, beside a pile of old lumber, she found broad leaves growing close to the ground. Then another patch farther uphill. The plants were different from the dry weeds covering the rest of the ranch. Ellie called Mara over. Why would these still be green? Mara shrugged. Shade, there isn't any. Ellie kept walking. The green patches did not appear randomly. They formed a broken line running away from the barn toward the upper pasture. Then she noticed something else. Flies hovered over one patch. A pair of bees kept landing on another. And the old cattle dog Duke had followed her without being called. He sniffed the green ground once, then began pawing at it. Mara watched him. Her expression changed. Your grandfather used to say animals find water before people do. Ellie looked back toward the barn, the cold earth, the fitted stones, the green line climbing the hill. For the first time, the pieces no longer felt separate. Something had once connected them. She returned to the opening in the floor and pushed her fingers into the narrow gap between the stones. A tiny clump of black soil came loose. Then another, and beneath it, barely visible in the flashlight beam, was a thin curved edge of old masonry descending into darkness, not a wall. A step. Ellie looked up at Mara. There's a room under the barn. Mara did not let Ellie go down alone. They spent the next hour clearing dirt from the opening until the first 3 stone steps were visible. Each one was narrow, hand-cut, worn smooth in the center. Whatever had been beneath the barn had once been used often. Mara tied a rope around one of the support posts and looped it around her waist. Ellie held the flashlight. You sure about this? No, that S comforting. Mara gave her a look. Then she stepped down. The temperature dropped almost immediately by the 4th step. The smell of dry hay disappeared. By the 6th, all she could smell was stone, damp earth, and something faintly metallic. Ellie followed. The stairway ended in a small room no larger than a pantry. Its ceiling was low enough that Mara had to bend slightly. 3 walls were made of fitted stone. The 4th had partly collapsed under packed soil. Along one side ran a shallow trough carved into the floor. Ellie aimed the flashlight at it. Mom, Mara saw it. A dark stain ran along the center of the trough. Not mud, not recent water. A mineral line, proof that something had flowed through there for a very long time. They moved deeper into the room. Against the wall sat 2 rusted iron brackets. Above them, a row of old wooden pegs had nearly rotted away. Ellie touched one. What was this place? Mara shook her head. I don't know. The room was too wet to be a root cellar, too carefully built to be a drainage pit, and too small to have been used for animals. Ellie turned the flashlight toward the collapsed wall. There, half buried beneath dirt, was a rectangular opening framed with stone, maybe 10 inches high, maybe a foot wide, a channel. Mara knelt. She scraped away loose soil. Cold air touched her fingers. Then she heard something so faint. She thought it was the rope moving behind her. She froze quiet. Ellie stopped breathing. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then tick. A pause. Tick. Another pause. Water. Somewhere behind the blocked opening, drops were falling. Ellie's eyes widened. There's water back there. Maybe you heard it. I heard dripping. That water. Mara almost smiled almost. But she had lived on a ranch too long to mistake a sound for salvation. A few drops could come from condensation, a trapped pocket, an old pipe. Anything. They needed proof. That afternoon, Mara drove into town and found Walter Hensley sitting outside the feed store. Walter was 81 and had lived in the valley his entire life. When Mara described the room, the stone trough and the cold air, he stopped rocking in his chair. What? She repeated it. Walter stared past her toward the road. Then he asked one question. Which barn? The old one, behind the house. He stood up slowly. You mean George Bell's milk barn? Mara frowned. It was a cattle barn. Walter shook his head. Not originally. He looked at Ellie. Before that barn was expanded, there was a springhouse there. Mara felt the words settle into the silence between them. A what? A springhouse. Walter's expression had changed completely. Your great-grandfather built it over running water. Walter came to the ranch the next morning. He moved slowly through the abandoned barn, one hand on his cane, the other brushing dust from the old beams as if he remembered every one of them. When Mara showed him the opening in the floor, he didn't look surprised. He looked sad. Been a long time since I saw this. Ellie turned toward him. You knew it was here? Walter nodded. Not exactly here. I knew there used to be something under the old milk shed. Your great-grandfather called it the cold room. Mara frowned. So it really was a spring house? Walter stepped carefully down the exposed stairs. He ran his fingers over the stone trough. This was where the water moved through. Ellie crouched beside him. For drinking sometimes. Mostly for cooling. Before electric refrigeration reached farms like this one. Walter explained. Families used naturally cold spring water to keep milk, butter, cream, and other food cooler than the summer air. The water didn't have to fill the room. It only had to keep moving. Cold water entered through one side, passed through a shallow channel or basin, and exited downhill. The stone walls helped hold the cool temperature. Ellie stared at the black mineral stain running through the trough. So there had to be a spring. Walter lifted one shoulder. There had to be water. That's the same thing. No. Walter pointed toward the collapsed inlet. That's where people get themselves into trouble. Mara looked at him. Walter continued. A springhouse does to make water. It only tells you somebody once had enough water here to build around it. The distinction killed some of Ellie's excitement. For a moment. Then she looked at the blocked channel again. But if there was enough water then, maybe there's still some now. Maybe that was all Walter would give her. They spent the afternoon removing loose debris from the room. Not digging recklessly, not tearing into the collapsed wall. Walter warned them that old stonework could shift without warning. Near the back corner, Mara found a rusted metal ring fixed into the wall. Ellie found the remains of a wooden shelf. Then, beneath 3 inches of mud, she uncovered something stranger. A narrow groove running away from the trough. It disappeared beneath the collapsed stones. She poured a cup of water into it. Instead of pooling, the water slipped slowly into the darkness. Drainage, Mara said. Walter shook his head. Could be the old outlet. Ellie followed the direction with her eyes. The groove pointed toward the lower orchard. Then she remembered the green grass outside, the broken line, the plants that had stayed alive through the heat. What if the water didn't just come into this room? Mara looked at her. What do you mean? What if it went somewhere after? Walter smiled for the first time. Now you re-asking the right question. That evening, Ellie sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. She drew the barn, the stone room beneath it, the inlet, the trough, the possible outlet. Then she drew the strange green line she had seen outside. On paper, the pieces began to connect. The springhouse was not the source. It was only one point in a system, and somewhere beyond the collapsed stone, that system might still be waiting. By the third morning, Mara had convinced herself they needed to know. Not hope, not guess, no. She called Ben Carter, a neighbor who owned a small excavator and had spent most of his life repairing fences, culverts, and irrigation lines across the valley. When he arrived, he stood beside the barn with both hands on his hips. You want me to dig under that? Beside it, Mara said. That barn is one hard wind away from becoming firewood. Then don't touch the posts. Ben looked at Ellie. This your idea? Ellie pointed toward the upper wall of the buried room. We think the inlet is blocked behind there, Ben sighed. Of course you do. They started carefully. No one wanted to collapse the stone chamber, or damage whatever remained of the old channel. Ben scraped away soil outside the barn while Mara and Ellie worked by hand inside. For the first hour they found nothing but roots and compacted dirt. Then Ben's bucket exposed a line of flat stones. Ellie climbed into the shallow trench, they re-going uphill. Mara stepped down beside her. The stones formed two rough edges with a narrow gap between them, a buried channel, exactly where the inlet inside the Springhouse pointed for the first time. Even Ben stopped joking. "Well," he said, "somebody built something." They followed it another 8 feet. Then 12. Then the channel disappeared beneath a mass of roots from an old cottonwood. Ellie knelt and cleared mud with her hands. The soil beneath the roots was darker, colder. She pressed her fingers into it. Wet, her heart jumped. Mara came over. Ellie squeezed a fistful of earth. A thin sheen of water appeared between her fingers. For a few seconds nobody spoke. Then Ben shook his head. "Wet dirt is in a spring." Ellie looked up. "I know," but she smiled anyway. They kept working. By late afternoon, the excitement had faded. The channel was clogged almost completely. Roots had pushed stones apart. Silt filled the bottom. The buried Springhouse contained only a few shallow puddles. No flowing water, no underground reservoir, no miracle. Mara stood in the trench covered in mud and looked toward the yellow pasture. They had spent 2 days chasing a cold patch beneath a ruined barn. And now they had exactly what Silas would say they had. A hole that evening, a truck slowed on the county road. Silas vain, he stopped beside the fence. Mara walked toward him before he could get out. Silas looked past her at the excavator. Then at the torn-up ground. "I heard you found water. We found an old structure, so no water." Mara said nothing. Silas smiled. "Old stones don't feed cattle." Ellie stood inside the barn doorway, listening. Silas lowered his voice. "My offer is still on the table, but it won't to stay there forever." He drove away before Mara answered for the first time since they started digging. Mara did not return to the Springhouse. She went inside. Ellie stayed. She sat on the edge of the trench until the light began to fade. Then she noticed something. The wettest dirt was not at the deepest point. It was along the uphill side. Ellie stared at it. Maybe they had been asking the wrong question. They had spent 2 days trying to find water beneath the barn, but the old Springhouse had never been the source. It was where the water arrived. Ellie stood and looked toward the darkening upper pasture. If the channel carried water here once, then somewhere uphill, something had fed it. Ellie was outside before sunrise, but this time she wasn't digging. Mara found her behind the barn with a notebook balanced against one knee and every clue they had found written across 2 pages. The Springhouse, the buried inlet, the wet soil beneath the cottonwood roots, the green strip beside the barn, and one arrow, uphill. Mara handed her a mug of coffee. "You giving up on the shovel?" Ellie shook her head. "We've been digging at the receiving end." Mara looked toward the trench. Ellie pointed to the old stone opening. If water entered the Springhouse from that side, then the source can be under the barn. It has to be higher than the barn. That was obvious once she said it, which made Mara wonder why none of them had said it sooner. They started by extending the line of the buried channel instead of searching randomly for damp ground. Ellie stood at the Springhouse inlet while Mara walked uphill carrying a fence post. "Left," Ellie called. Mara moved more. Another few feet there they repeated the process farther up the slope. For the first time they weren't following grass or guessing where the ground felt cool. They were reconstructing a line, 30 yards above the barn. That line crossed an old cottonwood standing alone in the pasture. Mara stopped. The tree bothered her. Not because it was alive. Because of where it was alive. The creek lay nearly half a mile away. No irrigation ditch passed nearby, yet the cottonwood was enormous. Behind its trunk, Ellie found a shallow depression cut across the slope. She kicked away the dead grass. A flat stone appeared, then another not scattered rock, a floor, the old water trace. Ellie crouched and exposed 3 feet of it with her hands. From there its direction was unmistakable. Straight downhill toward the Springhouse, she stood. "We have the line." Now they needed its beginning. They followed the depression uphill until the stones disappeared beneath years of roots and packed soil. That should have been the end of it. Instead, Duke trotted past them and stopped near a low rise, covered in brush. He sniffed once, then moved on. Ellie almost followed him. Then Mara noticed the trees. 6 thin trunks crossed the slope near the rise, willows. She knew willows from the creek bottoms. She had never thought much about these. Now she did. Ellie pushed through the brush. The temperature dropped slightly beneath the leaves. Not dramatically, just enough. Then her boot sank into soft earth. She froze. Mara stepped beside her and pressed the heel of her boot into the same spot. The ground gave, only an inch. But everywhere around it, the pasture was hard from drought. Ellie opened her notebook. She drew the Springhouse, the cottonwood, the buried trace. Then the willow line. Every mark landed on the same path. At the top of it sat the brush-covered rise. No miracle, no visible spring. Nothing anyone driving past the ranch would notice. Ellie looked downhill. From here, the abandoned barn looked almost perfectly placed beneath them. She finally understood something her grandfather must have understood decades ago. The barn had not been built near the water. It had been built at the end of a system designed to bring the water to it. Ellie closed the notebook, that S where it starts. Mara stared at the rise. For the first time, she didn't tell Ellie they were guessing. She only said, "Call Ben." They waited until late afternoon to dig. The heat had been brutal all day, and Mara refused to let Ellie work on the slope while the sun was overhead. By 5, the light had softened enough to stretch long shadows across the upper pasture. Ben came back with the excavator, though this time Mara asked him to stop 20 feet short of the willow line. "Hand tools from here," she said. Ben looked at the brush-covered rise. "You planning to find buried treasure?" Ellie answered before Mara could. Maybe they cleared the brush first. Underneath was a shallow shelf cut into the hillside. At first it looked natural. Then Ellie found the first stone, flat, squared, placed deliberately. A second lay 3 feet away. Then a third. They began removing soil between them. The deeper they went, the darker the dirt became. Ben crouched beside the trench and pushed 2 fingers into it. "That S damp." Ellie smiled. "Wet dirt still isn't a spring." Ben glanced at her. "You been listening," they continued. Within an hour, a narrow stone-lined channel appeared beneath the roots. It was older and rougher than the section near the barn, but the direction matched perfectly. Downhill toward the Springhouse. Ellie traced the edge with her hand. Someone had built this to move water. Not across the field. Through the slope, Mara stood above her, holding the flashlight. "Keep going." They followed the channel uphill another 6 feet before hitting a solid mass of clay. Roots and collapsed stone. The passage ended, or appeared to. Ellie stared at the blockage. Something about it felt wrong. She scraped at the bottom with a hand trowel. The soil there was almost black. Then water gathered in the shallow scrape. Not much, a teaspoon, then another. Ben leaned closer. Nobody spoke. Ellie cleared more clay. The tiny puddle returned. Mara's expression tightened. "Slow down." Ellie nodded. She stopped digging directly into the blockage and began clearing around it instead. The old stones had shifted inward over time. Roots had grown through the gaps. Fine sediment packed every opening. It wasn't a wall, it was a choke point. Ben cut a root as thick as his thumb. Ellie pulled away a fist-sized clump of clay for several seconds. Nothing happened. Then a bead of water formed between 2 stones. It swelled, dropped, another followed, then another. The drops became a thin thread, so small it barely made a sound. But it did not stop. Ellie held out her hand. Cold water ran across her palm. Mara sat back on her heels. For the first time in weeks, she laughed, not loudly, just once, a sound of disbelief. Ben looked downhill toward the barn. "If that keeps flowing." Ellie finished the thought. "It feeds the channel." They did not open the blockage farther that night. Mara was afraid a careless move could collapse the old stonework or muddy whatever source lay behind it. Instead, they placed a metal pan beneath the trickle. Then they waited. 10 minutes later, the pan was still filling. 30 minutes later, it overflowed. Ellie stood in the fading light and watched the water disappear into the buried channel, downhill. Toward the abandoned barn, the Springhouse had not been dead. It had been disconnected. And for the first time, they had proof that something uphill was still feeding it. Mara checked the metal pan before breakfast. It was full, not damp, not half full. Full enough that water had spilled over one side and darkened the soil beneath it. Ellie arrived seconds later, still pulling on her boots. She looked at the pan, then at her mother. "It didn't stop." Mara shook her head. "No, they carried the pan downhill and measured what had collected overnight. It was not enough to irrigate a field. Not even close." But that was no longer the question. The question was whether the flow was continuous. So Ellie placed a clean bucket beneath the opening and marked the water level with a pencil. An hour later, she checked again, then 2 hours later, then again at noon. The bucket kept rising. By evening, Ben had helped them clear another section of the old channel between the willow line and the barn. They worked slowly. Every few feet they found the same pattern. Stone, silt, roots, then stone again. The channel had not vanished. It had simply been buried by decades of neglect. When they finally opened the last clogged section near the Springhouse, Ellie ran downhill ahead of everyone. She disappeared into the barn. A few seconds later, her voice echoed up through the floor. "Mom." Mara climbed down the stone steps. At first, she saw nothing. Then she heard it. A faint sound moving through the room. Not dripping, flowing. A narrow thread of water entered through the old stone opening. It crossed the shallow trough in the floor and slipped toward the outlet on the opposite side. The stream was barely wider than a finger, but it moved continuously. Ellie placed an old tin cup in the trough. Cold water struck the metal with a soft ringing sound. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Mara touched the surface. It was colder than the air. By far, she looked around the small stone room. For years, it had sat beneath the barn, filled with mud and darkness. Now water was moving through it again, exactly as someone had intended generations earlier. Walter came that evening. He stood at the bottom of the steps and listened. Then he smiled. "That's how I remember it." Mara turned. "You heard this before when I was a boy," he pointed toward the trough. "Your grandmother used to set milk cans right there." Ellie looked at the water. "So this really ran all the time?" Walter's smile faded slightly. "Back then, yes." Mara heard the warning in his voice. Back then, they still didn't know how the source would behave after a week or a month, or during a worse drought. So Mara refused to call it salvation. Not yet. They installed a small temporary tank below the Springhouse outlet. No pumps, no big pipes, just gravity. By the following morning, the tank held enough water to refill part of the cattle trough. Ellie opened the valve. Water ran through the hose. The cattle crowded forward. Mara stood beside the fence, watching them drink. Across the pasture, everything was still brown. The bank payment was still due. Silas still controlled the water rights they had depended on. Nothing important had disappeared, except one assumption: they were no longer completely dry. And somewhere beneath the ruined barn, a thin stream kept moving through the dark. Silas returned 3 days later. He drove past the farmhouse without stopping. That alone told Mara why he had come. His truck rolled across the ranch road until it reached the cattle trough, where clear water flowed through a hose from the temporary storage tank. Silas stepped out. He watched one cow drink, then another. Mara crossed the pasture before he reached the hose. "Something you need," Silas pointed at the water. "Where did that come from?" "My land." His eyes shifted toward the abandoned barn. Fresh soil still marked the path of the restored channel climbing into the upper pasture. Silas saw it immediately. "You opened something." Mara said nothing. He walked several steps toward the barn. "A spring?" Ellie appeared behind her mother. Silas stopped for the first time since Mara had known him. His expression showed neither confidence nor amusement. It showed calculation. "I bought the senior ditch interests through this drainage," he said. Mara folded her arms. "This isn't coming from your ditch." "That may not matter." The words landed harder than a direct threat. Mara had expected Silas to claim the water. She had not expected uncertainty. Silas continued, "If that seep contributes to a drainage covered by one of the rights I purchased, and you re-intercepting or changing its historic flow, somebody is going to ask questions." "Somebody?" "My attorney, for one." Ellie stepped forward. "The water starts on our property." Silas looked at her. "That does automatically answer what can be done with it." Mara hated that sentence because it sounded reasonable. She knew cattle. She knew pasture. She knew what a failing pump sounded like from 50 yards away. She did not know enough about century-old water records to tell whether Silas was bluffing, and Silas knew it. He reached into his truck and removed a photocopied document. "I'm not shutting anything down today," he said. "Then why are you here?" "To make sure you understand that finding water and having an uncontested right to use it are two different things." He laid the document on the fence post. "If you want to keep diverting it, find your records." Mara picked up the paper. Diversion, priority, historic use, point of use. Descriptions referencing old parcels that no longer existed in the same shape. Silas climbed back into his truck. Then he lowered the window. "My property offer drops $20,000 next week." There it was. Not just a legal warning. Pressure. He wanted her reading complicated documents while watching her pasture die. He wanted uncertainty to finish what drought had started. After he left, Ellie looked at her mother. "He's bluffing. Maybe you think he owns it?" "I think I don't know." That frightened Mara more than Silas did. That afternoon they drove to the county records office. They did not go looking for a document saying the spring belonged to them. They looked for something more basic. What had this water been doing before Silas bought anything? For nearly 4 hours they found nothing useful. Then Ellie opened an old property file. Inside was a photograph, the Bell Ranch, nearly a century earlier. Behind the family stood a low stone structure, exactly where the abandoned barn now stood. Ellie turned the photograph over. 4 faded words appeared in pencil. "Springhouse, built 1912. Mara stared at the date. It did not prove Silas was wrong, but it proved something he would now have to explain. The Bell family had not discovered this water last week. They had been building around it for generations. The photograph changed the question. Mara stopped looking for proof that Silas owned nothing. She started looking for proof of what the Bell family had actually done. That distinction mattered, because a century-old photograph could show a springhouse. It could not by itself explain where the water came from, where it went, or how the family had historically used it. So Mara and Ellie stayed until the records office closed. The clerk brought out parcel maps. Old tax files, farm improvement records, survey copies so fragile she asked them not to remove the plastic sleeves. Most were useless. Then Ellie found a map dated 1936. Near the old barn was a small square. Beside it, "Springhouse," Ellie said. The clerk leaned over. "Looks like it." But Mara was looking somewhere else. A thin line had been drawn from the upper pasture toward the square. the same direction as the buried channel they had uncovered. At the bottom of the map was a reference to an earlier improvement survey. The clerk disappeared into storage. When she returned, she carried a folder tied with cotton string. Inside was a 1914 farm record bearing the Bell family name. Mara read the description slowly. A stone cooling house, supplied by Hillside Seep. She looked at Ellie. The words matched the land, not approximately. Exactly the hillside, the buried trace, the Springhouse, the cold water. But Mara kept reading. Further down was another notation describing overflow carried toward the lower garden and livestock area. Ellie read it twice, so they weren't only cooling milk. No, they were using the overflow. Mara nodded. That mattered more. Still, neither of them pretended they had found a magic piece of paper capable of ending an argument over modern water rights. What they had found was a documented pattern of use. A source, a route, a structure, and a destination, all on the Bell farm decades before the neighboring properties had been consolidated into the ranches that existed now. They copied everything. Then they drove to Walter Hensley's house. Walter studied the old photograph beneath the light over his kitchen table. That's George Bell. Mara leaned closer. Her great-grandfather stood beside the Springhouse. Walter tapped a dark line visible near the base of the structure that carried overflow downhill. For what? Garden, stock water, whatever they could spare. Ellie unfolded the 1936 map. Walter's finger followed the line toward the upper pasture, then stopped. I remember that trace. Mara looked up. Walter nodded. My father said. The Bells cleared it every spring. Roots would choke it if they didn't. To Ellie slowly turned the photograph over again. Springhouse built 1912. Below the date was another faded line she had missed at the records office. She carried it to the lamp. 3 words emerged. Keep channel open. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Mara looked from the photograph to the old map. Silas might still challenge them. A lawyer might still ask questions. The county might still want records they had not found. Nothing had magically become simple. But Silas no longer had the advantage of telling the story, as if the Bell family had intercepted some unknown source yesterday. There was another story now, one written into the land for more than a century, and they finally had enough pieces to tell it. The first thing Mara wanted to do was run a pipe to every dry corner of the ranch. The second thing she did was stop herself. The spring was steady, but it was small that mattered. For 4 days, Ellie measured the flow every few hours, morning, noon, evening before sunrise. The numbers changed slightly, but not enough to suggest the source was collapsing. Still, there was nowhere near enough water to irrigate the fields the way the old ditch once had. Mara stood beside the temporary tank with a notebook. If we try to use this like the old system, we drain storage faster than it fills. Ellie nodded. So we stop farming like we still have the old system. That sentence changed the direction of the ranch. They started with the cattle. Instead of letting animals drink from an open trough that lost water to heat and mud, Ben helped them install a smaller covered tank with a float valve. Then they moved the animals through tighter grazing sections so they would not destroy the remaining grass around a single water point. Next came the garden. Mara abandoned the idea of saving every row. She kept only the crops that mattered most. Ellie ran narrow drip lines along the soil. They covered the beds with old straw to keep moisture from disappearing as quickly under the August sun. Every gallon got a job. Nothing was allowed to become runoff. Walter watched them work one afternoon. You're using less water than your grandfather did. Mara wiped sweat from her forehead. We have less. Walter shook his head. No, you know more about what you have. The old Springhouse became the center of the new system. Water came down from the hillside seep. It passed through the stone room. From there, they directed the overflow into a storage tank below the barn. Gravity did most of the work. No large pump, no expensive new well, no attempt to force the land to produce more water than it naturally gave. The ranch began changing slowly. The vegetable beds stayed green. The cattle stopped crowding one muddy trough. The small orchard near the house received water only twice a week. Mara let the farthest pasture go dormant rather than waste what they had trying to make the entire ranch look alive. Silas drove past twice. Both times he slowed. Neither time did he stop. By the end of the second week, something else had changed. Mara stopped checking the mailbox for his offer. For the first time since the ditch went dry, she was no longer thinking about how to save the ranch they used to have. She was building a different one. Smaller in output, more deliberate, harder to break. That evening, Ellie stood inside the Springhouse listening to water move through the old stone trough. A century earlier, the same flow had cooled milk. Now it watered cattle and vegetables. The source had not become more powerful. They had simply stopped asking it to do the wrong job.